Hello, Lana. I want to believe that you're okay and that you are continuing to keep safe wherever you are. So, welcome to Biology Online Lesson. And today we are continuing to discuss on the topic of irritability, majorly in animals. And the concept under discussion today shall be the central nervous system. I hope by the end of the lesson you'll have learned one or two things, or even everything. Welcome and join me as we continue. So these are some of the objectives that we're supposed to discuss, and that by the end of the lesson we'll be able to answer a few questions from the area. Number one, we'll be expected to describe the components of the central nervous system, commonly denoted as CNS. Then number two, describe the major parts and functions of the brain. And then number three, describe the parts and functions of the spinal cord. Now, when we introduced the topic on coordination in animals, we said that coordination is brought about by the central nervous system. And we said that the central nervous system constitutes of two regions. That is the brain and then the spinal cord. So the brain is anteriorly located, and then the spinal cord is posteriorly located, and it actually emerges like a long stalk all the way to the tail region. Now, the brain is the major part of the body that is responsible for bringing about coordination, meaning that any process or any activity that occurs in the brain, in the body, that is mainly coordinated or integrated in the brain, save or except what we refer to as the simple reflexes. So in this case, we will be discussing on major parts of the brain, and we'll also be looking at their functions. So let's briefly go through the major parts of the brain. So this is an open part which exposes the internal tissues that constitutes the brain. For example, we have commonly we can categorize the brain into three regions. The forebrain, whereby in most cases it is covered by the cerebrum, almost 3/4 of the brain. Then the other part is the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is in between, just below the cerebrum. Then there is the pineal gland, which is just a side of the thalamus. Then below the thalamus we have the hypothalamus. Actually, the word hypo means under, therefore it is just the part of the brain that is below the thalamus. Then the pituitary gland, of course, we'll be able to delve into its role. Remember, it is a master gland because it coordinates or it controls the working of all the other glands. Then the pons, the medulla oblongata, this one constitutes, the pons constitutes the midbrain. The medulla oblongata is found in the hind part of the brain. Then the cerebellum together with the medulla oblongata forms that region, that is the hind region of the brain. Then arising posteriorly is the spinal cord. So before we look at the internal tissues, it is important to note that the brain is protected by a cover which is made of layers. These layers, they appear like envelopes, and commonly in biology we refer to these layers as the meninges. So the meninges constitutes of three layers. There is the outermost, which is just beneath the skull. Remember, the skull is the one that protects the brain and underlying tissues against mechanical or any physical harm. The outermost part of the meninges is what we refer to as the dura mater. The dura mater, as can be illustrated in the diagram here, is made up of tough connective tissues, and therefore that's why it is able to resist some mechanical tensions. From the dura mater, the other layer in between is the arachnoid mater. Remember, in the arachnoid mater, there is a higher supply of blood capillaries. Then the pia mater, which is the innermost layer that actually directly encloses the brain tissue, is made up of the blood capillaries, and these blood capillaries are the ones that supply nutrients and oxygen to the brain. Now, in the arachnoid mater, there is a fluid which is referred to as the cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid is the one that contains a higher quantity of nutrients together with oxygen. Now, if we get down into the internal tissues of the brain, we've said before that the cerebellum covers a major part of the brain. Now, if we open up the cerebrum, we realize that it has two halves. Those halves are the ones that we call the cerebral hemispheres. We have the left half, therefore given the term left cerebral hemisphere, and then the right, which is given the term the right cerebral hemisphere. Now remember, during coordination, the left part of the body, there are nerves that are directed to the right part of the brain. That is, from the left part of the body, all the impulses are coordinated in the right part of the brain, and vice versa. That means the right part of the brain, the right part of the body, its impulses are coordinated by the left part of the body. So this is a half or a longitudinal section of the exposed brain. So if you look at it keenly, there is a structure here that we refer to as the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the region that actually anchors the cerebral hemisphere and the other parts of the body. And in most cases, most of the nerve cells, they end up, their branchings or their dendrites end up into, or they are connected to the corpus callosum. Now, when you open up the brain, as will be seen in the animation that I will run later, we've said that the brain is made up of two halves. So it is separated by a fissure. It is separated by a fissure along this region. So having mentioned about the other parts of the brain, including thalamus, hypothalamus, then the cerebrum and the cerebellum, we need to note that there are other parts that are also significant. For example, the pituitary gland, which is just located beneath the hypothalamus. We have the pons that acts like a bridge, and it is in the pons that the nerves are connected from the cerebrum all the way to the cerebellum. And then there is this section which is a small swelling here, that is the medulla oblongata. We shall be able to see its function, and from the posterior end here, there emerges a spinal cord. So let me run an animation to show a 3D way in which the brain appears. So you can be able to see systems of the cavities within the brain, and in those cavities are where the nerves penetrate, and even the nutrients are supplied along the passing capillaries. Those cavities are the ones that we commonly refer to as the ventricles. Now this is the fissure that I was talking about, the brain having two equal halves. Let me turn it a bit. Two equal halves, the fissure, and then you have the fissure here. Then again, the cerebrum is divided into four components, or four parts that we commonly refer to as lobes. For example, there is the frontal lobe, and this is where the majority of the cerebrum is located. Then we have the parietal lobe, then the occipital lobe. So we shall soon see what are some of the roles of those lobes. And then the other lobe is the frontal lobe. So we said frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and then the temporal lobe. In most cases, the audiovisual interpretation is done here. Then we have the brainstem, and of course the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the center for coordination of body balance, movement, and posture. Then the frontal lobe, in most cases, are the roles that are played by the cerebellum, which includes thought functions such as reasoning, individuality, memory, amongst others that we shall see. Yeah, you can briefly pause this and look at some of the functions of the various lobes that you mentioned. Yeah, not going to say much of them, but I'll let the animation to run to the end. Good. Yeah. So I want to believe that you've been able to see the tree diagram of how our brain looks. So these are the major parts that you said. You can be able to pause that and then you draw that diagram so that you're able to master the various parts of the brain. Let's quickly look at some of the functions of these major parts of the brain. For example, the cerebrum is concerned or involved in voluntary or conscious activities of the body. For example, learning, judgment, reasoning, thoughts, individuality, personality, amongst others. Cerebellum coordinates and balances the actions of the muscles. Medulla oblongata, which is the brainstem, controls involuntary actions, for example, blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, together with swallowing. And then finally, the other portion of the central nervous system is the spinal cord, which is the main communication link that between the brain and the rest of the body, especially the lower parts of the body. So let's look at the spinal cord. So the spinal cord actually is enclosed in the envelopes or the meninges, and therefore superimposed by a further protection by the vertebral column. It is made up of two major parts, that is the gray matter and the white matter. You'll pause through and then look at the roles of the spinal cord. And majorly, the main function of the spinal cord is to coordinate reflexes that are managed by the spinal cord. These are the reflexes that we commonly refer to as the simple reflex. So let's look at the structure